And yet, despite the fact that many of these areas controlled by these daimyo on many levels look like and really function as independent states, it's still true that in some ways they are not really the same thing as what we would consider to be independent countries today. The eyes of these daimyo are, after a while, as Ashikaga authority really truly collapses, the eyes of all of these daimyo turn to Kyoto, and all of them, if they are successful, certainly they try to survive, but once they do survive and do amass some degree of regional power, the dream of these daimyo is eventually to become overlords of Japan in their own right. So one has to wonder, really, are these warring states or are these warring warlords who control large swaths of territory and function as if they were states? It's a good question, and I think I would like for you to think about that. There are good arguments to be made for either one of these positions. And these daimyo become known as Sengoku daimyo. Sengoku is a Japanese word meaning warring states. Sengoku Jidai is the warring states period, and Sengoku daimyo are warring states daimyo, basically daimyo from this era, who, once again, some historians say, starts as early as 1467 with the start of the Onin War. Some of these Sengoku daimyo are former Shigo daimyo, as we've talked about, but many are new, as we've also talked about. The Hojo, for example, were a minor clan who rose to prominence within the space of a couple of generations, and this was really something quite unexpected. And many of them rose to prominence because they had betrayed their former lords. Despite all of the focus on all of the recent focus, the modern focus on the honorable aspects of samurai culture, the code of this mythical code of Bushido that apparently makes samurai capable of lying and things like that. I hope that this course has done something to complicate that picture for you. There was this concept of loyalty. There was an understanding that loyalty was a good thing and a great virtue, as you have seen from your readings, but also as you have seen from your readings and certainly from these lectures, that was balanced by a very strong urge towards profit by nefarious means as well. And a word about Bushido, we will talk about this later as well, but Bushido is the way of the warrior, literally translated as the way of the warrior, and there certainly was something, there was that word, that is a contemporary word that was used during the medieval period, that was used very early on in samurai history, even before this period, and it is a word that is very expansive in some ways, but at its heart it does have this notion of loyalty being a chief virtue. The willingness to die in the performance of your duty was a chief virtue, and yet there was no one central Bushido. There was no one Bushido that was accepted across all of Japan as the code of the warrior. There certainly wasn't any legal document that said this is the code of the warrior and all warriors have to follow it. There were, as we've seen, the samurai codes, which talked about very specific aspects of what was honorable in relations between master and retainer, but there were many interpretations of what Bushido was, and one way to think about it was that there was no one Bushido, there were many Bushido. Every samurai essentially had their own Bushido. House codes, some of which you read for this class, specify parts of that house's Bushido. So it is not one monolithic concept as it is understood in today's popular culture, where all the samurai are kind of these hidebound, honorable automatons. It is a varied understanding of what a good samurai is, and it is certainly interpreted differently by different people, and certainly not always followed. Okay, sorry about that digression. I just thought it was very important to mention, especially in the context of the samurai constantly violating these kinds of codes. What the samurai did try to do was they tried to hang on to what they had, and then essentially later to expand. And also, everybody does eventually want to go to Kyoto. And what they want to do there really depends on the particular person, the particular daimyo. Certainly, unless you were a daimyo, you couldn't imagine of capturing Kyoto. But whether it was to use the Ashikaga shoguns as puppets, whether it was to establish a new shogunate, whether it was to arrive at some other kind of understanding with the imperial family, this was something that every samurai house decided for itself, because every samurai house by now essentially, or I'm sorry, not every samurai house, every daimyo house essentially functioned as a government of its own, ruling, as I said, something that in many ways resembled an independent state. These slowly turn into ever more, these parcels of land turn ever more into basically mini countries, because with generation after generation passing and succeeding daimyo generations, these arrangements of rule tying these higher samurai to the retainers and to the land, they become ever more institutionalized. Once you're in the second or third generation of rule by a certain daimyo house, you have achieved a certain level of stability. And not only does that help you maintain control over your territory, or in some ways help you lose control if you're seen as incompetent or evil or cruel and your predecessor father was seen as good. That happens quite a lot too. You get chased out sometimes. But basically you become identified with a particular region, and you develop some kind of stable interactions with your neighbors. Some of these are alliances, as we shall see in a later lecture. The alliance, for example, between the Tokugawa house and the Toyotomi house, and before that the Oda house. Very stable, productive alliances, or rivalries. The rivalries between the Uesugi and the Takeda daimyo, especially Uesugi Kenshin and Takeda Shingen, the most famous of these daimyo during the Warring States period, these become the stuff of legend. These two daimyo, for example, fought a series of 5 battles at a place called Kawanakajima, this border area, this island made by 2 rivers in between their territories. And their rivalry was certainly legendary. It is written down in war tales. It is retold down to this day. And there were many other daimyo who developed these kinds of relationships. With the Takeda and the Uesugi, it was kind of a love-hate relationship. They were both regarded far and wide as excellent military leaders, as just these legendary figures. And Kenshin was also regarded as very honorable, and despite the fact that the Takeda kind of hated him, they also very much admired him. And these kinds of interactions between these great figures, they are immortalized, as I said, down to this day, certainly in war tales, but also they found their way into popular culture. There are TV dramas, cartoons, all sorts of popular representations of these incredible figures. And they certainly, all of these daimyo do, grow to be dependent on their land, and they stick closer to it. They are not in any hurry as the Warring States period continues. They are not in any hurry to go to Kyoto to serve the Ashikaga. In fact, they are in no hurry to go to Kyoto unless it is at the head of a powerful army, and they can basically impose their will on their rivals. One other thing that happens, because these daimyo are so associated with their local areas, is that you get the growth of castle towns. Now, excuse me, before in Japanese history, certainly Kyoto was a city in the true sense of the word. There were also some places in Kyushu, Dazaifu, Hakata, which served as entrepôts for continental trade coming into Japan. There was also Kamakura, which was a warrior city, small-scale city, maybe large town, but something approaching an urban center. And then during the Warring States period, now you have these stable daimyo families associated with their territories for several generations, and they are based in one town or another, and over time these towns in which they're based grow in importance. These are called castle towns in Japanese history, of course, because the main castle of the daimyo was there, and around the castle you get the growth of merchant districts, you get the growth of farmland surrounding the castle to feed the castle. If it's a coastal city, you get the growth of shipping. Trade is rerouted through there. It becomes a center of consumption of all sorts of things, food, but also lumber and construction materials and iron and everything, people. In fact, it's kind of true for pretty much anywhere in the pre-modern period that towns kind of consume people. They are not self-sustaining, so they need fresh infusions of people from the countryside. So these castle towns really changed the landscape of Japan in a permanent way. We still see these castle towns, many of these castle towns, as centers of local Japanese life today, and even when the local center is not a former castle town, the idea that there is a local center of power away from Kyoto, which is more than just an administrative outpost, which is a center of culture, which is a center of consumption and production, brewing, miso, everything. That really dates from the Muromachi period, and especially from the Warring States period, when these local centers really come into their own.